They called it progress. The logging companies arrived first, clearing thousands of acres of old-growth forest in Kentucky and West Virginia during the 1880s. What they found underneath those ancient trees was worth far more than the timber. Coal seams running 30 feet thick in some places. Mountains filled with anthracite and bituminous coal that would power America's industrial revolution. But the companies didn't stop at mining the coal. They kept going. They removed entire mountains, and what's left today are massive canyons where ecosystems once thrived. This is the story of how American capitalism turned Appalachia into a sacrifice zone, and why the people who live there are still paying the price 140 years later. The year was 1878. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway pushed its first tracks through the mountains of southern West Virginia. Before the railroad arrived, most of these mountains were unreachable. Dense forests of oak, hickory, and poplar-covered slopes that rose 3,000 feet from valley floors. The eastern band of Cherokee and Shawnee tribes had hunted these mountains for centuries. White settlers who arrived in the 1700s mostly farmed the valleys and left the mountains alone. The terrain was too steep, the trees too thick. But the railroad changed everything. The railroad itself was an engineering marvel. Workers blasted tunnels through solid rock. They built trestles across gorges that dropped 500 feet. The construction killed an estimated 1,200 workers over a 3-year period. Most were Chinese and Irish immigrants who earned $1 a day. When a worker died in a tunnel collapse or fell from a trestle, the company simply hired another. The railroad wasn't built for passengers, it was built to extract resources, coal, timber, and anything else the mountains contained. Within 5 years of the railroad's arrival, timber companies from Pennsylvania and New York had purchased mineral rights to over 2 million acres of Appalachian land. They paid local families an average of 50 cents per acre. Most families didn't understand what they were signing. The contracts were written in legal language that deliberately obscured what mineral rights actually meant. Families believed they were selling the right to mine some coal. What they actually sold was ownership of everything beneath the surface of their land in perpetuity, forever. The land agents who negotiated these deals were instructed to be vague. They carried cash. They spoke in friendly terms about partnership and prosperity. Many families were illiterate. They signed with an X. The agents would read the contract aloud, but they'd skip over the clauses that mattered. The clause that said the company could enter the property at any time. The clause that said the company could remove any surface structures necessary for mining operations. The clause that said the family had no right to compensation for surface damage. Years later, when families tried to sue, courts sided with the companies. The contracts were legal. The families had signed. That was the end of it. One family in Logan County, West Virginia, sold mineral rights to 800 acres for $400 in 1884. They thought they'd made a fortune. $400 was 2 years' income for most mountain families. In 1920, a coal company began strip mining that same 800 acres. The family's farmhouse sat directly above a coal seam. The company ordered them to vacate. The family refused. The company obtained a court order. Sheriff's deputies arrived with the order and gave the family 24 hours. The family loaded what they could onto a wagon and left. The company demolished the house the next day. Total compensation to the family, $0. The Broadform deed made it legal. The logging began in 1883. Companies like the Elk River Coal and Lumber Company brought in crews of Italian and Irish immigrants who worked 12-hour shifts 6 days a week. They clear-cut entire watersheds. Trees that had stood for 300 years came down in minutes. The lumber went to build cities like Pittsburgh and Cleveland. But lumber was never the primary goal. Lumber was the appetizer. Coal was the main course. The scale of the logging operation was staggering. In a single year, 1885, timber companies removed an estimated 4 billion board feet of lumber from West Virginia alone. That's enough lumber to build 400,000 homes. The loggers used a technique called splash damming. They'd cut trees, pile them in stream beds, build temporary dams, then release the water all at once. The flood would carry thousands of logs downstream to collection points. This technique destroyed every stream it touched. The force of the artificial flood scoured stream beds down to bedrock. Fish populations were obliterated. Families who depended on those streams for drinking water had to dig new wells or haul water from miles away. But the companies didn't care about streams, they cared about what was underneath the trees. Survey teams followed immediately behind the logging crews. They used primitive core drilling equipment to sample the rock layers. What they discovered exceeded their wildest projections. By 1890, companies had surveyed the coal deposits underneath the freshly cleared mountains. What they found was staggering. The Pocahontas coal seam alone contained an estimated 14 billion tons of high-grade bituminous coal. At 1890 prices, that coal was worth roughly $420 billion in today's currency. The problem was extraction. Traditional underground mining was slow and dangerous. Miners had to tunnel into mountainsides, shore up tunnels with timber, and haul coal out by hand or mule. A good crew could extract maybe 10 tons per day. The companies wanted thousands of tons per day. They needed a faster method. Underground mining was also expensive. Every ton of coal extracted required roughly 3 tons of timber for tunnel supports. Miners had to be paid. Safety equipment, minimal as it was, cost money. Mules had to be fed. The profit margin on underground coal was acceptable but not spectacular. Companies were making money, but they wanted to make more money. Faster. With fewer workers, with less overhead. Engineers began experimenting with surface mining techniques in the 1890s. The idea was simple in concept, but revolutionary in practice. Instead of going into the mountain, remove the mountain itself. Use explosives to blast away the overburden, the rock and soil covering the coal seam. Then scoop out the exposed coal with steam-powered equipment. Early experiments were small scale. A crew would blast a section of hillside, exposing maybe 50 feet of coal seam. They'd extract the coal, move to the next section, and repeat. But even these small operations revealed the destructive potential. Blasting sent rock debris cascading down slopes. So the debris buried streams and vegetation. Toxic dust from pulverized rock settled over everything within a mile. Rain washed sediment and heavy metals into water sources. Within a year of the first experimental strip mine, wells within 2 miles tested positive for elevated levels of iron, sulfur, and manganese. The water turned orange. It smelled like rotten eggs. Livestock that drank from contaminated streams developed kidney problems. Some died. Local residents complained. The coal companies ignored them. The experimental sites had proven the concept. Strip mining could extract coal 10 times faster than underground mining. That ratio would only improve with better equipment and larger scale operations. That method was called strip mining. The concept was simple. Instead of tunneling into the mountain to reach the coal, why not remove the mountain itself? Use explosives to blast away the rock and soil covering the coal seam. Scoop out the coal with massive steam shovels. Move to the next section and repeat. Strip mining could extract coal 50 times faster than underground mining. It was also 50 times more destructive. The first large-scale strip mining operation in Appalachia began in Mingo County, West Virginia, in 1902. The Red Jacket Coal Company bought a mountain called Blair Mtn. They brought in crews with dynamite and steam-powered shovels. Within 6 months they had removed the entire top of the mountain. Where a 3,000-foot peak once stood, there was now a flat plateau covered in shattered rock and coal dust. The coal seam underneath had been exposed and excavated. 150,000 tons extracted in half a year. The mountain was gone. In its place was the first modern strip mine canyon. The blasting was relentless. Crews would drill holes 30 feet deep into the rock face, pack them with dynamite, and detonate. Each blast moved thousands of tons of rock. The explosions could be heard 20 miles away. Houses within 5 miles had their windows shattered repeatedly. Families learned to open their windows before blasting time to prevent breakage. The concussive force cracked foundation walls. Wells collapsed when underground water channels were disrupted by the shock waves. One family living 3 miles from the Blair Mtn operation kept a diary documenting the impacts. Over a 6-month period in 1903, they recorded 47 separate incidents of property damage directly attributed to blasting. Cracked walls, collapsed chimney, well going dry, livestock miscarrying after particularly large explosions. They filed a complaint with the county. The county took no action. The coal company had more lawyers than the entire county government had employees. Local residents were horrified. The blasting shook homes 5 miles away. Rock debris slid down the mountainside into streams, choking the water with sediment. Trees that survived the initial clearing died when their root systems were exposed to toxic runoff. Fish populations in the Tug Fork River collapsed. The companies didn't care. They had found a method that turned mountains into profit at unprecedented speed, and they scaled it up. The ecological destruction happened in stages. First came the physical destruction, blasting pulverized rock into fine particles. This dust settled over everything downwind. Crops turned grey with dust. Rainwater washed the dust into streams, turning them cloudy and brown. The sediment smothered fish eggs and aquatic insects. Within 2 years of the Blair Mtn operation beginning, fishermen reported that trout and bass had disappeared from the Tug Fork River. Species that had thrived there for thousands of years were gone in 24 months. Then came the chemical contamination. Coal contains sulfur. When coal seams are exposed to air and water, the sulfur oxidizes and forms sulfuric acid. This acid leaches into groundwater and surface water, lowering the pH dramatically. The Tug Fork River's pH dropped from a neutral 7.2 to an acidic 4.8 within 3 years. At pH 4.8, most aquatic life cannot survive. The river was effectively dead, but the contamination didn't stop at acidity. Exposed coal seams also release heavy metals. Selenium, arsenic, mercury, and cadmium all occur naturally in coal deposits. When the coal is underground and unexposed, these elements remain locked in the rock. When strip mining exposes vast areas of coal to weathering, these toxins leach out. Testing of wells near the Blair Mtn site in 1908 showed selenium levels 40 times higher than safe drinking water standards. Arsenic levels were 30 times the safe limit. Families were drinking poisoned water and didn't know it until they started getting sick. By 1920, over 300 strip mining operations were active across Kentucky, West Virginia, and Tennessee. Companies developed bigger explosives. They replaced steam shovels with gasoline-powered draglines that could move 500 cubic yards of earth in a single scoop. The pace of destruction accelerated. Between 1920 and 1940, strip mining operations removed an estimated 60 square miles of mountain peaks in Appalachia. 60 square miles. An area larger than the entire city of San Francisco simply erased from the landscape. The economic justification was always the same. Coal-powered America, coal-heated homes, coal-generated electricity. Coal was essential to national security during 2 world wars. The companies positioned themselves as patriots. Every ton of coal extracted was a blow against tyranny. Every mountain removed was a sacrifice for the greater good. But the greater good never included the people of Appalachia. Here's what the textbooks don't tell you. The profits from Appalachian coal never stayed in Appalachia. Virtually every major mining operation was owned by companies headquartered in New York, Pennsylvania, or Ohio. The coal was extracted by local labor, but the wealth flowed out of the region immediately. A coal miner in 1930 West Virginia earned an average of 60 cents per day. The company selling that coal earned roughly $12 per ton. A single dragline operator could help extract 3,000 tons per week. That's $36,000 in weekly revenue. The operator earned $18 for the week. The ratio was 2,000 to 1. Think about what this means in practice. A town of 5,000 people in McDowell County might have 800 men working in the mines. Those 800 men might collectively extract 50,000 tons of coal per month. At $12 per ton, that's $600,000 in revenue. The miners' combined monthly wages, $14,400, less than 2.5% of the revenue generated. The other 97.5% went to shareholders who lived in Manhattan, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh. This wasn't unique to one company or one region. This was the business model. Extract resources using local labor, pay that labor as little as possible, ship the resources out, bank the profits elsewhere. The coal companies also owned the company towns where miners lived. They owned the company stores where miners shopped. Miners were paid in company scrip, not US currency. Scrip could only be spent at the company store. The company store charged inflated prices. A pound of flour that cost 10 cents in a normal store cost 25 cents at the company store. Miners ended up owing more to the company store than they earned in wages. They were trapped in a cycle of perpetual debt. The companies claimed this system was necessary for remote mining operations. They argued that building towns and stores in isolated mountain regions required significant capital investment. The inflated prices offset the investment, but the math doesn't support this claim. Analysis of company financial records from the 1920s shows that company stores generated profit margins of 60 to 80%. A normal grocery store operated on margins of 10 to 15%. The company stores weren't covering costs. They were extraction mechanisms. The environmental destruction created a permanent underclass. When you remove a mountain, you destroy the watershed. Streams that once provided clean drinking water turned into toxic sludge channels filled with heavy metals leached from exposed rock. Selenium, arsenic, mercury, all naturally occurring in coal seams, all released when those seams are exposed to air and water. Families who had farmed valley land for generations found their wells contaminated, their crops poisoned, their livestock dying from kidney failure. The companies offered no compensation. Remember those mineral rights contracts from the 1880s? Those contracts included a clause called the broad form deed. This clause gave companies the right to do whatever was necessary to extract minerals, including destroying the surface land entirely. Families who owned the surface rights to their property had zero legal recourse when mining companies decided to remove the mountain their house sat on. Thousands of families were forced to relocate. Most received nothing. Some received $50 and a week's notice. Consider the case of the Hensley family in Harlan County, Kentucky. They had owned 200 acres of farmland since 1840. The land had been in the family for 3 generations. In 1887, the family patriarch sold mineral rights to a Pittsburgh company for $100. He thought he was selling the right to dig some coal. In 1932, that same Pittsburgh company decided to strip mine the property. The farm sat directly above a 40-foot thick coal seam worth millions. The company informed the Hensley family they had 30 days to vacate. The family protested. They hired a lawyer. The lawyer reviewed the 1887 contract and told them they had no case. The broad form deed was explicit. The company had the right to remove any surface structures necessary for mining. The farm was a surface structure. The Hensley family packed what they could carry and left. The company raised the farmhouse, the barn, and 200 acres of pasture. They extracted 800,000 tons of coal over the next 3 years. The Hensley family received zero compensation. They ended up in a company town 20 miles away, living in a 4-room shack and working in the same company's underground mine. They went from landowners to wage slaves in 30 days. By 1950, the strip mining canyons covered over 200 square miles of Appalachia. These weren't small gouges. These were massive excavations. Some canyons were 2 miles long, half a mile wide, and 300 feet deep. The exposed rock faces created permanent scars visible from aircraft. Satellite imagery from the 1960s shows the region looking like it had been bombed. In a sense, it had been. Companies were using industrial explosives designed for military applications, ammonium nitrate fuel oil bombs, the same explosive used in the Oklahoma City bombing. Mining companies were detonating the equivalent of multiple Oklahoma City bombs every single day across Appalachia. The scale of explosive use is difficult to comprehend. In 1965 alone, coal companies in West Virginia detonated over 23 million pounds of explosives. That's 11,500 tons. For context, the atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima had a blast yield equivalent to 15,000 tons. Appalachian coal companies were detonating the equivalent of 3/4 of a Hiroshima bomb every single year just to access coal seams. The difference was the Hiroshima bomb detonated all at once. The mining explosions were spread across thousands of blast sites. The cumulative effect on the landscape was arguably worse. Then came the worst innovation: mountaintop removal mining. Strip mining removed the peaks of mountains to access coal. Mountaintop removal went further. It removed entire mountains down to the base. The technique was developed in the 1970s when coal companies realized they could use even larger draglines and even more explosives, to remove not just the summit, but the entire geological formation. A mountain that stood 4,000 feet tall could be reduced to a plateau at 2,500 feet. Everything above that 2,500 foot line was classified as overburden, waste. It was blasted loose and pushed into adjacent valleys. This created a new environmental catastrophe called valley fills. Millions of tons of shattered rock, soil and debris pushed into valleys and streams. Some valley fills were over 800 feet deep and stretched for miles. They buried entire creek systems. Forests that grew in those valleys were completely entombed. The valley fill from a single mountaintop removal site could cover over 500 acres and contain 10 million cubic yards of material. That's enough debris to bury every building in downtown Manhattan under 40 feet of rubble. The companies called this reclamation. Federal law required mined land to be returned to its approximate original contour, but the law had a loophole. If the company could demonstrate an economic use for the flattened land, they were exempt. So companies flattened mountains, claimed they were creating land for future development, and walked away. 97% of mountaintop removal sites were never developed. They sit today as barren plateaus, too contaminated for agriculture, too unstable for construction, useless moonscapes. Between 1980 and 2020, mountaintop removal mining destroyed over 500 mountains across Appalachia. 500, not 500 acres. 500 distinct mountain peaks, gone. An area of over 1.2 million acres was strip mined during this period. That's larger than the entire state of Delaware. Scientists estimate that over 2,000 miles of streams were buried under valley fills. 2,000 miles. That's the distance from New York to Los Angeles. The human cost is incalculable. Cancer rates in counties with active mountaintop removal sites are 42% higher than the national average. Kidney disease rates are 70% higher. Birth defect rates are twice the national average. A 2014 study published in Environmental Research found that children born within 5 miles of an active mountaintop removal site had a 26% higher risk of birth defects than children born elsewhere in Appalachia. The toxins in the water and air were causing generational damage, and the economic promise never materialized. Coal companies always claimed mining brought prosperity, jobs, economic development, tax revenue, but counties with the most intensive mining are consistently the poorest counties in America. McDowell County, West Virginia, was the heart of coal country. In 1950, it had 100,000 residents and a booming economy. Today it has 18,000 residents. Median household income is $24,000. 43% of residents live below the poverty line. The coal is gone. The companies are gone. What's left are the canyons. Here's the part that should make you angry. The companies knew exactly what they were doing. Internal documents from Peabody Energy, Arch Coal, and Massey Energy released during lawsuits in the 2000s reveal that companies conducted environmental impact studies as early as 1967. These studies clearly showed that mountaintop removal mining would cause permanent ecological destruction, contaminate water systems, increase disease rates, destroy economic viability of affected regions. The companies buried these studies. They lobbied Congress to weaken environmental regulations. They funded think tanks that produced counter-studies claiming mining was safe and economically beneficial. They spent millions on propaganda. Television commercials showing happy miners with clean faces talking about providing for their families. Print ads showing reclaimed mine sites with a few planted trees, and the caption, "Renewed Land." What the ads didn't show were the toxic sludge ponds, the contaminated wells, the families with cancer clusters, the ghost towns where the population dropped 90% after the coal ran out. The propaganda campaigns were sophisticated. In the 1980s, Massey Energy hired a Madison Avenue advertising firm to create a series of television spots promoting clean coal. The ads featured scenic shots of Appalachian mountains, children playing in streams, and miners coming home to loving families. The voiceover talked about energy independence and American jobs. One ad claimed that modern mining practices had made coal extraction environmentally safe. It showed a reclaimed mine site with grass and young trees, implying that all mine sites looked like this. The reality was starkly different. That specific reclaimed site shown in the ad was one of only 3 sites in West Virginia that had been successfully reclaimed out of over 400 active sites at the time. It had cost the company $2 million to reclaim because it was their showcase property. They brought journalists and politicians there to demonstrate their environmental commitment. Meanwhile, the other 397 sites were toxic wastelands that would never support vegetation again. The coal companies also funded think tanks and research institutes. The Centre for Energy and Economic Development, which sounds like an objective research organisation, was actually funded entirely by coal companies. It produced studies claiming that coal mining created prosperity in Appalachia and that environmental regulations were destroying jobs. These studies were cited by politicians and appeared in news articles. Few journalists bothered to investigate the funding sources. The propaganda worked. For decades, the dominant narrative was that coal mining was good for Appalachia, and environmentalists were outside agitators trying to destroy a way of life. The final insult came in the form of automation. By 2010, advances in mining technology meant companies needed 90% fewer workers to extract the same amount of coal. A single massive dragline operated by 2 workers could do the job that once required 200 miners. Coal production in Appalachia remained high through 2015. Employment collapsed. In 1985, the coal industry employed 130,000 workers in West Virginia alone. In 2020, it employed 11,000. The jobs vanished. The environmental destruction remained. The communities that had sacrificed everything for coal were left with nothing but poisoned land and unemployment. Today, you can drive through southern West Virginia and see the canyons, miles of exposed rock face, plateaus where mountains used to be, valleys filled with debris, orange streams running with acid mine drainage, towns that look abandoned even though people still live there. Median home value in former coal towns is under $20,000. You cannot give these houses away. No one wants to live on poisoned land. The landscape itself is a monument to extraction and abandonment. The companies have largely moved on. Many declared bankruptcy and used legal maneuvers to avoid paying for cleanup. Patriot Coal, which operated dozens of Mountaintop removal sites, declared bankruptcy in 2012. The bankruptcy courts allowed the company to dissolve its environmental cleanup obligations. 43 mine sites were left abandoned. No cleanup, no remediation. The taxpayers of West Virginia are now responsible for managing the environmental damage in perpetuity. Some of the worst sites have been designated Superfund sites by the Environmental Protection Agency. This is the federal government's admission that the contamination is so severe that it poses an imminent threat to human health. As of 2024, there are 17 Superfund sites in West Virginia directly related to coal mining. The estimated cost to remediate these sites exceeds $4 billion. The federal government has allocated $80 million. At current funding levels, it will take 500 years to clean up the damage from 140 years of mining. Meanwhile, the canyons remain, permanent scars on a landscape that once contained some of the most biodiverse temperate forests on Earth. Scientists estimate that over 90 species of plants and animals endemic to Appalachian Mountains may have been driven to extinction by habitat destruction from mining. We'll never know the exact number because many species were never documented before their habitat was destroyed. The story of Appalachian strip mining is often framed as a story of economic progress versus environmental protection. That framing is a lie. This was never about progress. It was about extraction, extracting resources, extracting wealth, extracting labour, and when there was nothing left to extract, the companies left. They took the profits and left the poison. They cut the trees, they mined what was underneath. The canyons are what's left, and the people who still live there are left to deal with contaminated water, elevated cancer rates, and an economy that was gutted the moment it stopped being profitable to outside interests. This wasn't progress. This was plunder.